Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, this government has a talent for turning a silk purse into a sow's ear. They've done it with the flag referendums bill and now they're doing it with this legislation. This legislation should be something that all parties in this House would like to support. But the government has made such a mess of the bill that it's actually not possible to do so. This is something that New Zealand First wants, a good environmental reporting bill. But, Mr Speaker, this is not that bill. The defects in it are so fundamental that we can't support it. And there are three main issues. The first one relates to the fact that ministers are given the power to choose topics for reporting, and that is unacceptable to us. There are, and many other parties have said so in the House, there are better alternatives. One of those, which has been mentioned already in the debate today, is that the Secretary for the Environment and the government statistician could jointly make those decisions, and in doing so, the public could see genuine transparency and genuine independent decision-making. But there is another alternative, and it's one I quite like, and it is that there could actually be a schedule to the Act which could be changed every 3 years, which would state what those topics should be. And 3 years is not so long a period that it would be impracticable, rather not so short a period that that would be impracticable. And it would be good for Parliament to actually take part in such a process. It would be good for MPs to think about those issues, get their minds around them, and then we together could decide what the topics should be. As it is, Mr Speaker, Clause 18 is just another example of creeping increases of power to the executive under this government. And I have stood here in this House over the last few years complaining time after time about the creeping expansion of power to the executive by this government, and this is just another example of it. This is especially bad and unnecessary when it comes to environmental reporting, because environmental reporting must demonstrate integrity and must generate full public trust. Mr Speaker, the second main issue is this, that Clause 18 itself is not a robust process. And I'm looking at Clause 18, and it says in 18.2a that the Minister must be satisfied that significant areas, resources or numbers of people are involved for a pressure topic to be chosen, and in B, that topics must be measurable with robust statistical methods. Now that comes down to the personal opinion of the ministers under this particular bill, and that's most unsatisfactory. How do we know what matters are going to be looked at and whether they are going to be looked at objectively in making those decisions? Now, Minister Smith commented during the committee process by saying, look, don't worry about that, it's okay, because we have in Clause 18.3 a provision for consultation. Now, saying that means that he believes somehow that consultation is actually a substitute for an independent decision-making process, which of course it is not. It is simply an obligation to hear and to take into account the views of other people. That's not part of the decision-making process. It may well inform the decision-making process, but it is not itself independent decision-making. Because this is very important in that people must see that that process is free of political interference. Now, like Megan Woods, I don't actually think that there would be many ministers, no matter what party it would be, who would actually do that. But the point is that this bill makes it possible, and it could happen in the future that ministers do interfere inappropriately in that way. What the public expects is that the decisions will be made objectively on their merits. And, Mr Speaker, Clause 14 of the bill does not save the situation. That's the one that says that the Secretary for the Environment and the government statistician are required to act independently. But how can they do that under this bill when actually the ministers have all the power? It's just not possible, and clause 14 is valueless as a result. And in addition, there is clause 15, under which the Secretary and the Government Statistician are required to assure in their reports, quote, a fair and accurate representation of the state of New Zealand's environment or the state of the domain being reported on, unquote, but only, quote, as far as reasonably practicable, unquote. And the words "as far as reasonably practicable" completely compromise the assurance of fair and accurate reporting which ought to be at the core of this bill. And that's a great problem for us in New Zealand First. Now, Mr. Speaker, the third issue for us is the issue of transparency. Now, ministers must have regard to pressures on the environment which could cause adverse impacts and other environmental changes. And again, I look at clause 18.2, where the ministers must be satisfied that the pressure topics chosen have an impact on significant areas, resources, or numbers of people, measurability, and the relationships between topics and impacts. But in the end, these requirements actually place very little limitation on ministerial discretion. So it's actually a very important issue and a very big problem for New Zealand First when we are required to, when we are being asked to support a bill on which there is such little limitation on ministerial discretion. So what that means in practice is that ministers could actually decide not to report on some topics at all, and nobody would know that they had taken such a decision. And that's actually a very severe defect, because the ministers could decide not to report on a topic simply because it is inconvenient for the government or might embarrass the government. That's a very, very serious issue for us. So why, Mr. Speaker, are we not seeing much more transparency when it comes to the regulations which will prescribe the topics to be covered in synthesis reports and the topics to be covered in domain reports? Mr. Speaker, without transparency, you don't get integrity and you don't get the trust of the public. And that is what is at the core of this bill. That is the fundamental reason why New Zealand First can't support it. So what does transparency really require then? First of all, it requires, I think, the background information upon which the decision is made to be made clear. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, it must show what the decision is in detail, why the topics were selected, why they were the highest priority, and so on. But, Mr. Speaker, not only will the bill fail the transparency test, it also prevents the Official Information Act from operating as intended in relation to what is called untested information. Officials will be able to withhold that without genuine reasons for doing so. And that, again, is far too much power in the hands of officials, and that shouldn't be the case. The public are entitled to access that information. It is their information. There is no reason for the secrecy surrounding that. This is, after all, about decisions about what to report on the environment. It's not a major state secret. Why is the reason for all this secrecy? The other members opposite haven't said so. For all of those reasons, Mr. Speaker, there is no way New Zealand First can support such a badly drafted and defective bill, even though we, like other parties, would like to see a good environmental reporting bill brought forward to the House.